Mainly because of the types of work that I do. I get a lot of people who come to me with questions about how to study philosophy. And one of the recurring motifs that I see creating problems for a lot of people has to do with studying in a, let's call it, chronological manner. So, meaning beginning at the start and ending at the end point, whatever that happens to be. Now, that's rather difficult to do for a discipline that has, not only millennia of history, but isn't quite finished yet. Philosophy is still ongoing. But there's a lot of people out there who either have come up with this idea themselves or they've been told by other people, perhaps other scholars, that what they really ought to do if they want to study philosophy in the best way or an adequate way is that they have to begin with the pre-Socratics and then they have to move on through philosophy, or maybe they begin with Plato, or maybe they begin somewhere else. And they have to do things in a, historical, this came first, this came next sort of way. There's no problem calling that chronological. And I'm going to say that there's nothing inherently wrong or bad about doing this, although, as you're going to see, there's some problems that may be insurmountable depending on how strict you want to be in what you conceive of studying philosophy chronologically to be. And it is one way to structure your own self-directed study or to structure a curriculum of philosophy. It's not the worst way, right? I suppose much worse than that would just be sort of picking books off the shelf at random and reading them, and maybe not even reading the whole book, but just reading a bit of it. But it isn't necessarily the best way to study philosophy either. And, I think we have to begin by distinguishing two different senses in which you could study philosophy chronologically. So the first one would be, let's call it the grand sweep. You begin with the pre-Socratics, and then you move on to Socrates, largely through Plato, but of course you wouldn't want to leave Xenophon out. And then you get Aristotle, and then where do you go from there? And you try to go all the way up to the present. And you could say that there are some projects out there that are trying to do the history of philosophy like that. For example, the podcast History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, which, I don't know if they have any gaps or not. I haven't looked at it for a while. And you could also talk about a more limited scope where you're going to study a particular philosopher chronologically, that is, begin with his or her earliest works and then move in through those early works into the middle works and work all the way to the end point of their life, their curriculum, what it is that they're offering to the world. And that's not a bad idea to do. You could also do this with a movement of philosophy. Like you could be like, well, we're going to study the utilitarians. So obviously we begin with Jeremy Bentham. Well, maybe not so obvious because Hume talks about utility and so do other people before him. But let's just say we begin with, the official founder of the doctrine. So we do Bentham and then, we look at some other minor figures. Then we get to John Stuart Mill and Henry Sidgwick and then all the other utilitarians that wind up being important in the 20th and 21st century, right? So that's possible to do as a mode of study. So before we look at whether this is actually feasible, is this the best way to go? Is this actually a good way to go? And I do want to say there are some possible advantages to looking at things chronologically. So, one is that there tends to be a coherent history. So you're probably going to get more out of studying Immanuel Kant by looking at what he was doing before he had his critical turn, after his, awakening from his dogmatic slumber by reading Hume, and then, reading say, the first critique and the prolegomena, and then moving to the later stuff, the moral philosophy, the critique of judgment. It's not a bad way to go. You're probably going to learn a good bit by looking at things in that sort of light. Or we could think about René Descartes, right? Rules for the direction of the mind, and then, we get the world, which doesn't get published, but the discourse does, and then we get the meditations and the objections and replies and principles of philosophy, and towards the end of his life, correspondence with Princess Elizabeth and the passions of the soul. Okay, that's not a bad way to go. You can actually see the development of ideas taking place, and you also get to see who is influencing not just that philosopher, but the people that they are engaging with. You get to see the sort of common language across a group of thinkers that's shared, common vocabulary that's being developed. It's a way to understand what some people have called an intellectual tradition. So there's nothing bad about approaching things chronologically. But I do want to say that there are going to be some issues, some problems that you do have to face. And the first one is the problem, I think this probably suggests itself to everybody, the problem of actually being systematic and comprehensive. If you're going to study philosophy, just Western philosophy, don't even worry about non-Western philosophy, just stick with the stuff that happens in Europe for a long time, or in the Mediterranean, let's say. Well, there's a lot of figures. There's a lot of thinkers. We have a lot of texts. And the more that you study, when you first begin, let's say you take an intro to philosophy class and your teacher gets up there and they give you a spiel and they're like, yeah, first there were these pre-Socratics, we're going to look at them a little bit, and then there was this Socrates guy, and Plato was his student, and Aristotle was his student, and then we get the Hellenistic period, and you've got Epicureans and Stoics and skeptics, and then eventually Christianity comes on the scene, and then the things kind of, depending on what story they're telling, go into decline, or it gets better, whatever, and then we get into the medieval period, and maybe that's the Dark Ages the whole time, or maybe it's actually a time of great intellectual ferment and all of that. Well, there's a lot of thinkers in there. And so if you're going to be comprehensive in how you're being chronological, you really can't skip all of these people. You can't afford to say, well, there were the Neoplatonists. We'll read Plotinus and that's good enough. No, there's all these other thinkers. And there's also the Middle Platonists that you should read, like Plutarch and Alcinous, right? Yeah, that's a problem there. And along with this, we can say, well, how do we actually know who we're supposed to read? Well, we got to rely on some sort of narrative. So if you're going to be chronological, it's not as if you have to buy into somebody's history 100%, but you got to begin from somewhere. So who are you going to think is worth fitting in? Some of the narratives that we have out there are kind of biased, or frankly, outdated from, their bad history that's been left behind by good historians, or there's huge gaps. So think, for example, about the prevalent thing of saying, well, we've got these ancient thinkers, and then Christianity comes on the scene in the West, and it all kind of goes into decline. But we do have a couple smart guys like Augustine and Aquinas, and then after that, modern philosophy with, René Descartes, and maybe Hobbes is also in there, and maybe Machiavelli, and, Spinoza, and these continental rationalists, and British empiricists, and blah, 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 right? I mean, you've all heard these stories, or perhaps you haven't yet, right? But they're not adequate narratives of what actually took place. It's way messier, way more complicated. There's lots of really cool stuff happening during the end of antiquity and moving into the Middle Ages. The medievals didn't even know they were medievals until much, much later on. Actually, they didn't know. It's their historians centuries later who know that. So, this is kind of a problem. We have another big problem. So let's say you actually are some sort of independently wealthy person who doesn't have to work for a living, and you can read all these people in the ancient period and the medieval period and the early modern period and, of course, the Renaissance. And, we get up to the 19th, 20th, 21st century. There's so many philosophers to read. Think of it as like a funnel, right? Where it's going along for a while and then it just gets huge. Who are you going to read? I mean, just to read all of the people who have worked within the tradition of, say, continental philosophy, Anglo-American continental philosophy. We'll leave out the people who are doing it in Scandinavia and in other places. Just that. There's too many people for you to possibly ever read your way through, and we're continually adding to it. So that's a bit of a problem as well. We can also talk about the people who've been left out of the story if you go to older histories of philosophy. I'll give you a prime example of this. Women in early modern philosophy. You can get contemporary histories of philosophy. Grayling is a prime example where most of the important women scholars who were acknowledged as such during their time are just completely passed over, or they have a footnote or maybe a page or so, when really they deserve much more. Mary Estelle and Margaret Cavendish and Mary Wollstonecraft. We could go on and on and on and on and on. So there's parts of the chronological story that you might have to do a bit of digging to actually find. And it's not just for women in early modern philosophy. We've got medieval women as well, just not quite as many whose texts we have. So that's a set of problems right there. Another big problem is that if you're being really strict about this, I'm going to study philosophy in a chronological way. I'm going to read the fragments that we have of the pre-Socratics, and then I'm going to read, Plato, and we'll read some Xenophon because you get Socrates through him as well. And we'll read some Aristotle, and then we'll move into these Hellenistic thinkers and, Roman imperial thinkers. There are so many of them that if you actually want to do a good job and read through all of them, you'll probably never in your lifetime get out of the ancient period and into the medieval period. So you're going to have to skip somebody. You're going to have to leave somebody behind. And that's going to be a decision that you make without fully knowing, because you haven't read them, whether you're leaving some jewels on the table, so to speak, and sweeping them away. You could say, well, I'll just start later. I'll start at the medieval period or early modern period. Same problem. If you're going to actually be comprehensive in your chronology, there are so many thinkers that you probably won't get through all of them. Another big problem, and this is a side issue, there is no agreed upon definition of what counts as philosophy and, what its nature is, what its goals are, what its objects are, how it develops, and what is not philosophy, what is rhetoric or theology, or pick whatever other discipline you want. And you can say, oh, but I have some. Well, you've got some, but those are only local. They're not global. There is no consensus. The understanding of what philosophy is has changed many times. So you've got to figure out, if you're going to be comprehensive about this in your chronological approach, who gets in, who doesn't get in. Because you don't have a lot of extra time to read people that aren't philosophy then, right? So that's going to be a bit of a problem. And we also have this issue of contemporaries. How do you, in fact, decide who came first and who came after when you've got people doing philosophical work at the same time? So if we're doing the early modern period, does Hobbes come before Descartes? Should Descartes come first and then Hobbes after? What about Blaise Pascal? What about, and we could go on and on and on about these thinkers. Or, let's say we're doing the imperial Roman period. Okay, so we've got, Plutarch and Epictetus and Dio Chrysostom, and they're all important thinkers, but they're all flourishing around the same time. Who should we study first? Should we maybe do like early works by them? Ooh, that's kind of tough to do because Epictetus didn't actually write his discourses. Arian recorded them, right? And we could go on and on and on with similar sorts of problems. If we're going to stick with just a philosopher or a movement of philosophy, well, how do we do that? For example, with Plato, there's lots of theories about, well, this dialogue came before this dialogue. Those are just theories. We don't actually have a chronology for Plato's works. What we have are a bunch of theory-dependent frameworks out there for what order you ought to study or read these in. And those are, by the way, different. Those are mostly from, Germans in the 19th century and then, later people in the 20th century. Those are different from what the actual Platonists prescribed for people to study them in. The order is different. What about with Aristotle? Did the Eudemian ethics come before the Nicomachean ethics? Well, a lot of scholars think so. We don't know. Well, we're not sure. So what chronology should you have for that? And then it gets more complicated yet. If they wrote some letters, let's take Anselm of Canterbury, for example, who had a very cool letter collection that he had deliberately preserved. Or let's take Seneca, right? He wrote a ton of letters as well, but he also wrote a whole bunch of works. So do you have to read the first works first? And then if a letter was written in between that work and another work, you got to read that letter before you move on to the next work. You can't read the whole letter collection, right? Because it's over the course of the author's life. Again, you can see the ridiculousness of this. If you're going to be very strict about this, you're going to get yourself into all sorts of problems. And that's with letters. What about notes? What about sketches? What about outlines for things? It's all a lot of trouble. And so here's what I'm going to say. If you want to try to approach things in a roughly chronological way, I'm not going to discourage you. I'm just going to say, the stricter you get about that, the more comprehensive and systematic you get about this, the more you're going to run into these problems that are inevitably going to arise for you and could discourage you. And I don't want you to get discouraged. I want you to study philosophy. I want you to get as much as you can out of studying the thinkers and texts and topics in this field that I have devoted now more than half of my lifetime to, because I found it valuable. So I don't want to discourage you. What I will say is that when you're really studying philosophy in any sort of serious way, you're inevitably going to be selective. So don't feel bad about the fact that you can't get to everybody or that you didn't do enough attention to this particular century of philosophy. And you're also going to be what we could call iterative. That means you're going over things again and again. You don't read all of Plato's works and now you've got Plato down and mastered and you never go back and read it again. You're going to have to go back and reread. And when you do, it's rewarding. Now, you're going to take yourself out of your chronological order when you do that, because you're not going to make it, over the course of your lifetime from everything in the beginning to everything at the end, and then the next, 30, 40 years, go back and start again. No, you're going to take certain figures and go back to them over and over again. I read René Descartes' Meditations at least once a year, in part because I teach it every year. I read through most of Plato's dialogues once a year. I read through some texts only once every 10 years and some texts close to every month. That's normal in philosophy. So I think that it's perfectly fine if you're laboring under a feeling that, I'm not doing philosophy and the study of it right because I'm going out of order, or I haven't read everything in this period so I can't move on to the next. Take that weight off your shoulders. You don't have to place that burden upon yourself. And if there's somebody out there who's telling you that you're doing it wrong because you haven't read all of these other thinkers before you move on to the next, maybe you shouldn't be listening to them, at least on that point. So I'll encourage you, if you want to do things in chronological order, try it out. See how far it gets you. I'm not going to legislate for you saying, oh, you must do philosophy in this way. I'm a pluralist myself. I think there's a lot of legitimate ways to study philosophy. I'm just pointing out some of the problems and you might even say paradoxes that arise when you decide for yourself that you're going to try to study philosophy in a very comprehensive and chronological manner.